Hello there, my name's Card, and today I just wanted to briefly talk about the most recent round of Planet of the Apes films, and specifically the basic narrative flaw that I think has held back their full potential and generally led to their tepid reception among audiences and critics alike, as well as the one simple change I think could have been made during their production to rectify the whole issue. Just to lend a bit of background to my thoughts here, I'm a pretty big fan of the Planet of the Apes series as a whole. I love the original films, I enjoy the newer films despite their flaws, and I really dig the original 1963 novel the films are all based on. And I think the most important thing when adapting a franchise, either from one medium to another for the first time, or just doing a modern reboot, isn't so much necessarily making sure it's a perfect one-to-one retelling of the exact story, so much as it is a matter of using the same basic premise to explore the same themes. I talked in a previous video of mine, which I'll also link at the top of the description, about the many attempted adaptations of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, and how the best of those understand that a story like the Earth being invaded by aliens should be shocking and transgressive. Any Planet of the Apes adaptation needs to have something similar, but the way it should play out is a bit different. And spoiler alert for the original book and the movies from here on out, by the way. The narrative arc of any Planet of the Apes story needs to be that a stand-in for humanity as a whole, be it an individual or society more broadly, it comes into conflict with a militant outside force, like the apes, which initially appears primitive, but which is revealed to actually be more advanced than it seems. Then, crucially, any initial hope we'll easily see humanity win against this outside force is undercut by the very hubris of thinking it would be easy. And the scope of this cycle of hubris is revealed again to be much larger than we initially thought it ever was to begin with. The basic moral of the story is that hubris and arrogance can very quickly lay waste to even the grandest, most well-intentioned ambitions of one man or a whole civilization. The simple reason that the antagonistic force is a bunch of monkeys is that it's a very easy way to represent social de-evolution. In the original novel, the way this plays out is that a human explorer from Earth inadvertently finds his way to an alien planet where the people he meets are very primitive and very caveman-like, essentially. He quickly learns that these people live in fear of being rounded up and wiped out by a society of gorillas and orangutans and chimps. That's the outside antagonistic force. And this man from Earth, seeing just how advanced the ape society is the first big shocking reveal. In the book, the protagonist can't properly communicate with the apes. They don't speak our language. But he's essentially captured and gradually shown the ape civilization and told of their history. The second big shocking reveal towards the end of the story is just how advanced this ape society is. Their cities rival anything humanity has ever made, and the reader finds out that the apes essentially took over the planet after their version of humans became complacent and lazy and let society gradually collapse. By the time the story we're reading has started, the monkeys were already on the verge of completely eradicating the last holdouts of the post-apocalyptic human resistance, and there's no real way to stop it. If the novel has one through line to keep in mind, it's that what is essentially mankind, if on another planet, had their/our place at the top of the natural order usurped because the decadence of modernity sapped humanity of its natural edge, and another species, the apes, was there to take our place. One that's a lot like us in many ways. They're upright primates, and they've since learned how to use tools and build city-sized communities. But they're evidently a lot more militaristic, and if not primitive per se, they're at least very crude in their methods. We, the readers, are meant to take away that if that could happen on a planet just like ours, it could happen here with how we're headed too. Of course, a societal collapse wouldn't literally come in the form of militant apes, but the monkeys are a stand-in for whatever regressive or militaristic social backlash might follow a period of social decadence on Earth. For what it's worth, the man who wrote the original Planet of the Apes novel, Pierre Boulle, had essentially been on the periphery of the French resistance during the Second World War, being a supporter of Charles de Gaulle, and his correspondences with peers and friends from the time reveal that Boulle thought that the Vichy fascist occupation of France during the war was A, very bad, and B, the result of Europe resting on its laurels a bit too much in the 20s and 30s, getting decadent again, and letting a regressive militant force build up in the middle of polite society. So, in a really roundabout way, the apes in Planet of the Apes are basically a Nazi metaphor, and the author wants to emphasize proactively not getting complacent and letting Nazis emerge. That's all well and good, but returning to what makes an adaptation good, first and foremost, the movies obviously aren't that heavy-handed with political symbolism, although there are a fair few allusions here and there with how ape society looks down on humans, like 19th century race science equivalents and stuff like that. For the most part, though, even the 1960s films are more subtle about their messaging, but generally do a very good job of knowing what thematic elements to hold over from the book into the movies, what stuff to cut, and what new elements you can introduce which work well specifically when they're made for a movie that you can't do in most other mediums. In the movie, the original movie, the main protagonist, the Charlton Heston character, is an astronaut from Earth, whose spacecraft is a bit faulty and ends up crashing on an unknown planet. Heston has spent 2,000 years in suspended animation since his mission began, and he doesn't know where he is. After the crash, all he knows is that wherever he's come down, it's populated by primitive, caveman-like people. And, like in the book, very shortly thereafter, Heston and a number of other people are captured by a group of technologically advanced apes who can talk and walk upright and use guns and ride on horseback. How the next few events play out is a bit different between the book and the film, largely just because of the differences in what you can easily do in the two formats. In the book, the ape society the protagonist is taken back to is a grand futuristic city. In the movie, it's more of a large-ish settlement, and it looks quite a bit more crude or rustic than what we'd think of a human town of that size ought to look like. That's a filmmaking conceit. It's easy to write down a description of something fantastical and futuristic on paper, but when you really need to build sets and hire actors and extras to populate your city, a director might start to think about how to reasonably scale things back. The other necessary change here is that in the book, the protagonist and the apes can't communicate. They don't share a common language. That's not a problem because we, the reader, can always just be told what the apes are thinking and doing without them needing to verbalize it to the human character. In the original 1968 movie, the apes speak English perfectly well. After all, you need to have an audience understand them. And if half this film's dialogue was just monkey noises, it would be near impossible to make sense of. However, the film still cleverly comes up with a way to have protagonist Charlton Heston be unable to speak with the apes after his capture. As he's being apprehended by some guerrilla soldiers, they shoot him in the throat. A pretty sizable portion of the film happens while Heston is in the custody of the ape settlement, and he has to slowly adjust to the reality he finds himself in, as well as heal from his wounds. Eventually, after spending quite a bit of time as the ape's prisoner, Heston does attempt an escape, and in the process runs around one of the ape's scientific research complexes and a history museum. The fact the film's protagonist can't speak properly for most of his time among the apes allows the movie to slow roll the reveal of just how large this strange and hostile monkey society is. This all builds into the next big reveal. Charlton Heston is recaptured, and as he's caught in a big net, he finally manages to choke out a few choice words for the ape police dragging him away. No doubt you'll have heard the line before, even if you haven't seen the film. Here it is.
Go get him!
Taylor! Why did you run away?
Security police.
I'm in charge of this man.
No longer, madam. He is now in the custody of the Ministry of Science.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
For once, the apes are caught off guard by the fact one of their human captives can talk. It's a moment that isn't really in the book, but it works so effectively in the film because that's just a medium where dramatic action scene reading and good line delivery can potentially sell that sort of moment better than if it was just written down in a novel. And Heston does deliver it very well. There's a reason, after all, it became such an iconic line. By this point in the movie, Heston's had his big moment trying to escape, he's had that escape attempt foiled, and seeing just how sophisticated the ape society he's trapped in really is. A lot of the remainder of the film plays out the same as the last time he was captured, but now he can more or less talk. The protagonist tries to reason with his captors that he's from another world and that he's not like the other humans they know, and that he ought to be freed, but they just don't listen to him. Heston tries to make the case that the humans like him are really an intelligent species, and tries to prove it using what he, as an astronaut, knows. Long story short, by the end of the film, even if a lot of apes in a position of power over him know he's right, they'd still rather just ignore him because it's easier. Although, in the movie's closing few scenes, Heston essentially makes another escape attempt, riding off along the coast on horseback with a primitive human girl he's met along the way. And the apes, more or less, decide he's just not worth the trouble of going after and just let him go. In the film's epilogue, Heston and the girl eventually stumble upon the ruins of the Statue of Liberty. It's another twist that wasn't in the book, but it serves to drive home the point that this planet isn't just like Earth, it is Earth. The astronaut's abortive mission hasn't delivered him to another world, it's just dumped him back on the ground 2,000 years into the future. Once again, it's become iconic in large part just because of how good of an ending it is. It works as a reveal in the movie specifically because it's a great way to convey that information visually. And once again, Charlton Heston does a really good job selling it, delivering an angry, teary-eyed breakdown as he realizes the implications. It's another scene you'll almost certainly have heard of, or at least seen referenced elsewhere. But in either case, here it is.
God. I'm back. I'm home. All the time it was... We finally really did it. You maniacs! You blew it up! Oh, damn you! God damn you all to hell!
This final reveal really solidifies the film's central theme, the decay and de-evolution of human society. But the thematic strength of the film's whole second half isn't created by just having all these twist reveals. Rather, it's created by having the Charlton Heston character go through a complete narrative arc of discovering the size and sophistication of this ape society, repeatedly attempting to fight back against it by escaping or proving his captors wrong, and ultimately coming to grips with the fact it's a fairly futile effort. The closest thing that the first Planet of the Apes film has to an antagonist character is the head ape bureaucrat and scientist Dr. Zaius, the intelligent orangutan who most strenuously opposes the notion that Heston himself is anything more than a beast or that humanity was ever an advanced species. But the crucial thing is, the antagonistic force Heston fights in the movie isn't just Dr. Zaius himself per se, but rather the ideology he represents. Which specific ape scientist might be condemning humanity in any given moment is completely incidental. What matters is why an ape would do that. This movie, like any good Planet of the Apes film, understands that the series doesn't need personal villains for a protagonist to fight against. Any villainous character should just be a representative of a more intangible antagonistic concept. Back in the 60s and 70s, they ended up making 5 of these Planet of the Apes films, and they all hold up pretty decently for period sci-fi. I don't want to spend all day breaking down these movies. However, I do think it's worth very briefly exploring how at least one more of these 70s films also managed to get the necessary theme and tone right before I finally get into what I wanted to explain today, how the modern Planet of the Apes movies have largely failed to. The second of the original films was called Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and it starts right where the first one ended, with Charlton Heston on the beach having just found out he's really on Earth. After his little breakdown, he just keeps riding his horse further and further, looking for any remaining free humans outside the boundaries of ape society. There's a few other B-plots that go on in the background, but the core story of Beneath the Planet of the Apes is that Heston does end up finding a secret underground community of humans who haven't yet been subjugated by the apes. This group of humans lives in the subterranean ruins of the old Earth, and they must have found a missile silo down there at some point, because these humans have in their possession a functioning, immensely powerful nuclear warhead ready to be launched. A lot of the interpersonal moral drama of the movie comes from Charlton Heston trying to warn the leader of the underground human society about the consequences of wanting to use the warhead against the apes under even the most dire of circumstances. Still, the underground humans live in such an ever-present state of fear of being discovered and attacked by the apes that they keep the warhead on standby at all times, and have even taken to literally worshipping it like a divine figure. Here's a clip of that.
The heavens declare the glory of the bomb, and the firmament showeth his handiwork.
His sound is gone out unto all the lands, and his light unto the end of the world.
He descendeth from the outermost part of heaven, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. There is neither speech nor language, yet his voice is heard among them.
Praise him, my strength and my Redeemer.
Glory be to the bomb and to the holy fallout, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
The initial premise of the film, that there is in fact a hidden society of humans still on the planet capable of opposing the apes meaningfully, is a natural way of continuing the story beyond just the first movie. And the reveal that they've got this massive nuke is a great and fitting way to raise the stakes by the end of the first act. Knowing that humanity has a weapon capable of very potentially wiping out the apes, and themselves, gives the characters of this story a moral question to properly grapple with. Charlton Heston and the leader of the underground humans don't even directly fight with one another over what the best course of action is all that much. They don't need to, and the movie doesn't need to have one bad guy or a singular villain for the protagonist to battle. The narrative arc of this film is how this faction of humans attempts to square the handful of different ways they know things could play out. Should they perhaps launch the nuke now and try and retake the surface world? Or should they launch the nuke but just hope it kills off the apes and they can live out the rest of their days in peace without the threat hanging over their head? Or should they just try to hope and stay undiscovered and undisturbed down there in the ground? That sort of conundrum is the antagonistic tension of Beneath the Planet of the Apes. The second act complication is that Charlton Heston realizes that all these underground people, because they've been living in close proximity to a big nuclear weapon for several generations, they're all now suffering from all sorts of genetic mutations and radiation sickness and that sort of thing. This complicates the ethical dilemma everyone's in, because it means being underground with the warhead is itself a compounding problem, and even if their society remains undiscovered, the humans' lives down there can't keep going on forever and ever. It's not exactly the most subtle message in the world, but Beneath the Planet of the Apes continues the series' theme of social degradation by just coming right out and saying that even just having a nuke around is dangerous. The movie's even quite literal with its symbolism, showing most of the underground humans to have some sort of massive radiation-induced rash or cluster of tumors underneath their robes. The bomb is literally degrading the integrity of people's bodies cell by cell. By the end of the movie, some of those background B-plots eventually lead to the apes discovering the humans' underground sanctuary, and it looks like direct conflict is ultimately unavoidable. Again, I already gave you a spoiler alert before, but there's a big shootout scene towards the end between the ape army and the last of the human holdouts in their underground base. Charlton Heston tries his best to talk the leaders of both sides down, but it doesn't work and he's fatally shot. He's slowly bleeding out from a big chest wound, but even with his dying words he still tries to stop the conflict. Again, it doesn't work, and with the last of the humans surrounded and being advanced upon by hostile apes, he presses the big red button that sets off the nuke. Dramatic fade to bright white, and voiceover narration tells us that everyone, man and ape alike, was wiped off the face of the planet. End of movie. Here's the scene itself, since I imagine you might want to see it.
Help me. You asked me to help you? Man is evil, capable of nothing but destruction. Bloody bastard.
In one of the countless billions of galaxies in the universe lies a medium-sized star, and one of its satellites, a green and insignificant planet, is now dead.
All of the old Planet of the Apes films are basically like this. They follow a pattern that works without being overly formulaic. Each movie understands how to use the premise of apes having taken over the planet to explore a conflict between two imperfect worldviews. And the trademark move of the franchise is to always work a few big twists in there, including into the final scene itself. Some of the later 70s sequels got a bit schlocky, but they still work. And furthermore, each movie basically works as both a standalone story and, when viewed as a series of successive stories, being told about one world. If you haven't seen them before, I'd also definitely recommend you go find them and give them a watch sometime. While we're on the topic, I also think it's worth at least acknowledging the standalone 2001 Tim Burton directed Planet of the Apes. I don't want to spend too much time on it, because it's not one of the classic films or part of the new reboot, but I think it's still worth mentioning that I appreciate its effort to explore the themes of the original while playing around with the premise in a very different way. It suffers a lot from some very cheesy early 2000s performances and design choices, but it is a decent, self-contained little project. Burton obviously is a competent and experienced director who had a distinct idea in mind for how he wanted to shoot his remake. And I enjoy a lot of the little nods to the original he adds, like recontextualizing the "get your paws off me" line and giving that dialogue to an ape.
Take your stinking hands off me, you damn dirty human!
Also, the scene at the end where protagonist Mark Wahlberg comes face to face with an ape version of the Lincoln Memorial, he is oft derided as kinda dumb, but I can't be that mad about it, since that scene was actually more or less lifted straight from the novel. Now, I bothered explaining all that because I really want to properly drive at why the latest rebooted Planet of the Apes films don't really capture the ethos of the franchise. Now, I will say that the 2011, 2014, and 2017 movies are nice enough in their own right, and in several respects they do a lot right. A lot of the cinematography and how individual scenes are framed and shot is really good. The actors' performances generally come across well, and in particular the motion capture performers and the CGI technicians or whoever who animated the photorealistic monkeys all did a fantastic job there. And, as I understand it, these reboot movies were all made on a relatively low budget for a big blockbuster film these days, and I suppose that's always to be commended. But, as standalone movies, or when viewed as a trilogy, the reboot film's biggest flaw is that there is never any ideological conflict befitting the Planet of the Apes series. There may be individual good guys and good apes who fight individual bad guys and bad apes, but there is no narrative arc in which any two or more properly articulated viewpoints ever come into conflict or oppose one another in any meaningful way. The first reboot film, 2011's Rise of the Planet of the Apes, is probably the strongest of the newest three. The basic plot involves the first of the intelligent apes being created in a genetic research facility as the result of a man-made virus, and they're not treated all that well, and eventually they all break out, setting up the eventual downfall of human society we'll see in its two sequels. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with trying to take the franchise in a more overtly hard sci-fi direction, but the problem is that the film never really substantively ties its plot into any social critique. There are definitely unlikable individual characters, and we're meant to sympathize with the captive research apes. But there is no good worldview and bad worldview we're supposed to take any sort of message out of seeing come into conflict. The core value of the Planet of the Apes series was always the changing of society for the worse, and the militant backlash to that change which invariably leads to even more terrible outcomes. You don't even need to be overly cynical to make a story like that either. All the classic film's protagonists were shown to essentially be in the right, trying their best to keep things stable and as peaceful as possible, even if they didn't often succeed in doing that. In Rise of the Planet of the Apes, the monkey apocalypse happens essentially just because this is a franchise that needs to have a monkey apocalypse happen. Although, for what it's worth, a little bit of cheap interpersonal man-ape conflict did give the filmmakers an excuse to write that line in again in a new way.
Take your stinking paw off me, you damn dirty ape!
No!
But, for all its faults, it is an interesting take on the premise of how the apes become intelligent. And, taken as the first film in a trilogy that could have explored the classic themes of the series, it would have been a good way to establish everything we'd need to know. Unfortunately, the trilogy as a whole didn't really live up to its fullest potential in the end. In any case, the second reboot film, 2014's Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, jumps ahead 10 years and shows us how clustered communities of intelligent apes have begun to form, while the man-made illness that caused them to become intelligent has also drastically reduced the human population. The film sets up that there's a pocket of human survivors adjacent to the main ape camp, and had the screenplay gone in a different direction, the plot could have focused on that as a source of tension. Unfortunately, what we ended up getting was that storyline basically just peters out, while the movie focuses more on interpersonal conflict between individual unsympathetic people who needlessly jeopardize the fragile state of peace between the humans and the apes, and the climax of the film ends up becoming a CGI fight between the original leader of the apes, Caesar, and a bonobo named Koba who wants to usurp leadership and attack the humans. If the majority of the plot had just been Caesar and Koba clashing with one another about the ethics and feasibility of attacking the human community, that could have been a great Planet of the Apes story. Unfortunately, 2/3 of the movie's runtime was given over to the human B-plots, presumably just to make things more palatable to audiences. Flashy action and characters who can actually talk will be more engaging for most moviegoers, I suppose. But it's still unfortunate that Koba, or a character like him, wasn't given a lot of time on screen in service of even just giving a protagonist ape like Caesar a clearly articulated set of beliefs to push against. Again, there is no narrative arc here. Not every film necessarily needs a grand storyline, but realistically, trying to redo the Planet of the Apes films, you need to do more than just, here are some apes, and eventually an action scene might happen. As the middle film in the trilogy, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes also suffers from needing to set up its own sequel too, so we end up with all the potential conflict plot lines from the human-ape adjacent society situation left up in the air. So far, 2 movies into the reboot trilogy, there hasn't been much of a meaningful narrative. There hasn't been all that much ideological conflict, and we haven't even gotten any of the series' trademark big shock twist reveals yet either. Still, going into the third of the 3 reboot Apes movies, 2017's War for the Planet of the Apes, I still think the potential was there to stick the landing, so to speak. The plot of War for the Planet of the Apes picks up a few years after the events of the prior film, and we get 2 major storylines. One, that there is now a heavily armed human militia going around, properly and explicitly attempting to exterminate all the intelligent apes. And 2, that the apes themselves are now on the back foot and looking to get away from this militia. This is the closest we get to seeing 2 conflicting ideological positions competing during any of these reboot movies. And while the remaining apes and the militia-aligned humans don't directly interact all that much throughout the movie, the juxtaposition of showing what each side is doing in scene to scene does go away towards giving us that sort of ideological back and forth. On the ape side, Caesar and his efforts to safely relocate his community, while sympathetic and noble to an end, also represent the continuing transition from society as it once was to a world more inherently hostile to man. On the militia side, they've got their own leader. Woody Harrelson plays a gruff military colonel stereotype, but he does serviceably represent a foil to the ape's ambitions. Harrelson is ruthless and pragmatic, and embodies a militant response to social upheaval. It's not at all subtle, but around the start of the movie's third act, Harrelson is in the same room as Caesar, and basically lays his position right on the table. Here's the scene to jog your memory.
Mercy. Do you have any idea what your mercy would do to us? You're much stronger than we are. You're smart as hell. No matter what you say, you'd eventually replace us. That's the law of nature. The irony is we created you. We tried to defy nature, bend it to our will. Nature has been punishing us for our arrogance ever since. 10 months ago, I sent out recon units to look for your base. My own son was a soldier with one of the units. One day, he suddenly stopped speaking. He became primitive, like an animal. They contacted me and said that they thought he'd lost his mind, that the war was too much for him. Then the man who cared for him stopped speaking too. Their medic had a theory before he stopped speaking, that the virus that almost wiped us out, the virus that every human survivor still carries, had suddenly changed, mutated. And that if it spread, it would destroy humanity for good this time. Not by killing us, but by robbing us of those things that make us human. Our speech, our higher thinking would turn us into beasts. You talk about mercy? What would you have done? It was a moment of clarity for me.
Again, not at all subtle. But we do at least get a sense of his motivations, unlike, say, Koba in the previous film. Bloodthirsty as he frequently comes across, Harrelson does have a real, reasonable interest in exterminating the apes, and thereby the disease they spread. This scene also reminds everyone watching about the whole degenerative man-made disease subplot established in the previous two films, which is helpful, but as I'll explain shortly, they don't use to its fullest potential. As the movie starts wrapping up, Caesar recognizes the inevitability of open conflict between the apes and the militia and begins to ready an attack. The colonel, Harrelson, realizes that he's showing the symptoms of the disease and ends up taking his own life. And the finale ends up being a big gunfight in which, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the apes end up being able to use some explosives to cause an avalanche and wipe out all the militiamen. I think it's a weak ending, mainly because it largely throws away the interesting dynamic between the two competing moral stances on display in favor of just giving the more sympathetic apes a quick and uncomplicated victory where they can just ride off into the sunset free. The problem is that it means the last two movies were just a lateral move. The situation the apes are in once the credits roll here might as well be where they were at the end of the first Reboot film. The finale ends up turning Harrelson's character, and by extension his militia following his own death, into just another generic villainous force opposite Caesar, rather than a compelling antagonist in its own right like it could have been. Arguably worse still, the whole avalanche saves the day thing isn't so much a shocking twist as it is a deus ex machina, an easy way to just end the story. I can't say that the ending of War for the Planet of the Apes doesn't seem like it fits in with the rest of the Reboot trilogy, but that's because the same pitfalls this movie is let down by are the same ones that the prior two films ended up also not being able to avoid. Which is a shame because, like I said earlier, I like the classic movies and the novel and the premise they're all based off of, and it's just that if we're getting modern remakes of them, it would have been nice to get stronger films. I don't think you need to just repeat the old films verbatim to make new ones. In fact, you should definitely avoid doing that. But making new entries in any franchise works best when you understand what sort of narrative form that franchise's stories fit well. And Planet of the Apes isn't necessarily at its best when it's this sort of hard sci-fi action series. For all the inherent absurdity that comes with the premise of being about a militant post-apocalyptic monkey society, Planet of the Apes is a remarkably dry, contemplative, human story. Now, just for fun, like I said earlier, I still think the third reboot movie could very well have pulled off an ending for the trilogy befitting the franchise. Let's say I was in the position of writing and directing The War for the Planet of the Apes. Even assuming I had to use the same cast of characters, the same setting, and couldn't do anything unreasonable budget-wise, what would I, as someone who has a lot of opinions about these movies, have changed? I think keep the first third of the film roughly the same. Give us time to establish where the apes are, why they're starting to come into open conflict with the human militia, and make sure to give us that scene juxtaposition where we get to see the viewpoint of both Caesar and Harrelson's colonel. Move the conversation between Harrelson and Caesar that I showed you earlier closer to about the halfway mark of the movie's runtime. From there, have the militia and the apes fight. This can be where you get the big action scenes that audiences want. And by and large, have the militia win. Show ape casualties. Show apes captured. Show them breaking ranks and running away. You could even go so far as to have Caesar himself be caught or captured here. Towards the final third of the film would be where, again, you use the idea that Harrelson ends up realizing he's got the ape disease. Even if you want to have had him and his militia have killed literally all the intelligent apes by then. The movie already established that the symptoms of this disease in humans were mutinous, diminished mental capacity, and aggression. So I would have had the movie end up with the entire human militia movement becoming a pack of primitive tribalistic people. You could even have it explain why this disciplined military commander was acting so tersely and belligerently the whole movie. The first time I ever saw the film, I guess I might have just been getting my own hopes up, but this is what I thought was being foreshadowed the first time the disease plot point was being brought back up. I honestly wanted to see that these military guys literally end up becoming the ape people we know from the classic films. I would have had the disease begin to gradually turn the remaining humans into what we see inhabiting the society in the 1968 movie. I think that's a reveal that would have fit the franchise. After all, it does make a lot of thematic sense, and it's not like it contradicts any of the established canon, for whatever that's worth. The apes in the 1968 movie don't look like realistic monkeys. They look more like devolved people. They're upright and bipedal and wear clothes. Again, the message of the novel, as well as all the original films, isn't that a dominant society can be simply replaced outright by another. It's that a society can itself be transformed by the reaction to an attempt to replace it. Anyway, by the time I sat down to write and record this, it looks like the powers that be have announced a fourth reboot film. Frankly, I have my reservations it will get this series back to top form. And if it flops, the franchise as a whole is likely to be put on ice for quite some time, like what happened when the 2001 Tim Burton film underperformed. Either way, I'm just glad I was able to finally get my thoughts out there about why I think the new Planet of the Apes movies just didn't live up to their potential. And I am perfectly willing to be pleasantly surprised by the next one sometime in 2024, it looks like. Thank you for listening, if you still are. If you might want to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page, or take a look through my other videos. Goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.